Good morning, everyone. I hope that everything is okay with you. I'm pretty much back to normal after the last crazy week and a half that I've had, as I told you, with the COVID. So now everything is much better. I hope you enjoyed the game last night, whoever you were rooting for, if at all. And I have to, since you guys, for some reason, decide not to send me background pictures of your dogs or your cats, this is my responsibility to put those background pictures. So this is the most relevant one I found, and I have to keep thinking in order to be more innovative when it comes to my background pictures. But that's okay. Um, a few things that I want to go over before I talk to you about today's topic. So first of all, I got a few questions from emails from you about access to the course material, what I put on the website, what I don't put on the website. So what you have here on your screen now is just a picture of Canvas for section 500. It doesn't matter. It's for both sections. It's the same thing. What I want you to be aware of is all the information that all the different files, the different slides, it's always going to be here in modules. So in every module, and here you see the modules that you, the students, can see. You have here week 1, you have here the slides. Week 2, you have the slides. Week 3, you have the slides. Also, there is a syllabus here, and there is the course website link here, and there's also the link to the attendance form. So everything that you need in order to read the material for class or register your attendance or anything else, everything is here on the module. So I update this section every class day when I send you the link to the videos. This is the same time I'm also updating those sections. So everything that you need should be here. So you shouldn't have a problem to find those things. And announcements is where you will see, of course, your announcement. That's the only things that I'm actually using in Canvas. Once we start looking at grades, I will give you details about that. So that's one thing that I wanted to clarify. I'll just put the regular slide on the screen for us now. Okay. One more thing, tomorrow, Tuesday, I will send you a new link to the second task that we have for this semester. That's going to be a survey task, not a quiz like you had for this week, but a survey task. The survey task is pretty simple. You will get the instructions in the link itself. You just click the link and you go into the survey. You have to, again, you have to provide your personal information, your name, your UIN, and your section number. And then you will be facing a series of questions. Again, there's nothing to be prepared in advance for this survey. This is just asking for your personal opinion for different situations that will be described in the survey. All I'm asking for you in exchange to getting those 5 points for this first survey is answer that seriously, take it seriously. Don't rush through the answers, because I can see everything that you do. So if somebody sends me his survey back and it takes them like 2.5 minutes to finish those things, I know you did not really read the whole thing through. So make sure you read that, take it seriously, and you'll get those points. It's not a problem. So the link will be sent tomorrow at some point, and you will have to submit the survey by Friday night. Just a reminder, this is the first survey. We're going to have 3 surveys throughout the semester. This is the first. You're going to have to finish it by Friday night. One last thing, we're starting to see on the horizon the midterm task, which I talked about in the first lecture. I will, on Wednesday's lecture, I will provide you a little bit more details about it, so you'll know how to prepare for that. This is something that you're going to have to submit by the end of this month, early March. So I will start talking about that on Wednesday. Okay. All right. So quick review on last week's lecture, Wednesday. I finished the discussion about different system material type theories of IR by talking more about the neorealist theory, and specifically I talked about the security dilemma, the fact that every country that decides to engage in some form of action which involves offensive military expansion, whether it is creating arms race, whether it is acquiring more territory, how that creates a dilemma for it because of the potential risk that may lead in the long term, because once I am more powerful, then my rival is more concerned. So my rival has incentive also to go into an arms race or to expand the territory. So essentially, my initial decision to take some action in order to increase my influence, increase my power, increase my security, has led to me being less secure in the long run. So that's the main idea behind the security dilemma. I remind you again how it was linked directly to what was called the spiral model, how two countries which have no intention in going into actually conflict, both of them try to promote the idea of their own security, might spiral into a conflict. And then I talked about the second theory, which was the power transition theory, and its differences from the realism, mostly that the system is in hierarchy when there is one large dominant power which has to enforce all the rules, the role of the status quo having satisfied and dissatisfied powers, and if a dissatisfied power has enough capabilities in order to challenge the dominant power in the system, then the likelihood of conflict is much, much higher. This is going to be a much more severe war because it's actually a war to decide who will set up the rules and the order of the system. If you have any other questions about power transition theory, about neorealism, about material theories overall, you are more than welcome, as always, to email me. Okay, so let's move on. Today, we shift the discussion from talking about material theories, such as we talked here, realism, neorealism, power transition theory, and talk about the theory of liberalism. I'll talk about the background of the theory of liberalism, a little bit about what are those liberal perceptions, what are they, the basics of that framework, and how is it different from the material theories such as realism and neorealism. So liberal theories emerged as a counterweight, as a response to the rise of the neorealist approaches, again, in the late 1970s, early 1980s. In contrast to the realist perspective, the focus of the liberal perspective is on the frequent and long-standing occurrences of international cooperation. So while realism talks so much about explaining the propensity of states to be in a long-term conflict with one another, liberalism is the exact opposite, and it talks about the different conditions that lead states, provide states with incentives to engage in long-term cooperation with one another. Right? Another important aspect that we have for liberalism is a structural hierarchy. So this is, in a way, it's similar to the power transition theory. I'll get to that in a minute. The structural hierarchy with an important central organizing principle of the international system. And this structure of the system implies that there is one central actor that has to enforce the rules or the agreements actually between states, because when we're talking about cooperation, we're talking about different agreements between states. The emphasis on cooperation in this research framework suggests a substantial interest in any actor having a chance to have absolute gains rather than relative ones. So it's not about how much I have compared to you. It's me as one actor in the international system actually having absolute gains from my cooperation, from my behavior with other countries. This is an important part. Now, what are the central authors that provided us with this theory of liberalism is Professor Moravcsik, which you read his work for today. He presented the foundation of the theory. He was very adamant on the importance of describing the theory in a way that it's going to be a scientific theory and it's going to be appropriate, for empirical evaluation, right? Go back to everything I talked about in the first week. It was very important that those kinds of theoretical frameworks, those kinds of theories will be scientific and can be tested. What actually does that mean? It means essentially, when he set up his explanation of that theory, is that the theory will rely on core, clear assumptions, which will give it its scientific credence, and it's going to distance this liberal views from kind of ideological or utopian view of international relations. One of the things that he wanted to avoid is from people to say, well, this is liberalism, it's like a utopian view of how states behave towards one another. He said, no, I'm going to base it on very clear assumptions that's going to make it scientifically valid, and then it's going to be a theory, not some kind of an ideological perception of the world. This is from the paper itself. You have here this quote which talks about the importance of the state-society relations of the theory. And in that quote itself, we can see one of the first distinctions of liberalism from material theories. And that comes into play also in the structure of the system and the role that the inner dynamics of the states and the society actually has on the way that states behave in the international system. So let's talk about that now. Some of the distinctions. So the first clear distinction, or the contrast for the liberal theories from realism, relate to the structure of the system. Liberalism embraces the assumption that the system structure is a hierarchy. It's, again, the central organizing principle of the system. This is how the system is built. That means that we have one global hegemonic or central power that enforces the agreements between states. So instead of looking at the system as an anarchy, when there's no one power that can enforce any kind of agreements, right? That was one of the important foundations of realism. We have a hierarchy with one strong power. In this case, we can also call it hegemonic power, which will enforce all the rules of the system and the norms. In that sense, the theory of liberalism is similar to power transition theory, when we have this hegemonic state, which will maintain the different rules of the system, and in that sense will also maintain the peace and stability of the international system. So while liberalism does not speak directly to international peace, it speaks mostly for cooperation, but cooperation by itself will lead to the lack of conflict in the international system. But again, this is similar in that sense to the ideas behind power transition theory with one hegemonic power. Another contrast of this theory from the realist theory is the focus of liberalism on state preferences as driving the outcome, rather than the means of the international system driving the outcomes. So while in realism, outcomes in the international system are mostly a function of strategic condition between actors, so the different constraints they face coming from all kinds of material elements, such as their capability, their military capabilities, or their wealth. In this case, we're focused on the preferences of the state as the driving force. Now, what that says for us, because states' preferences, right, every state might have different preferences, that might lead to suggesting that we can criticize liberalism as, is this really an international system theory? Because if we're looking at the main preferences of each state as driving its behavior, then the behavior is not relevant to the international system itself. It's based on the theory. Well, Moravchik talks about two counters to that argument regarding that fact that even though the theory relies heavily on state preferences as explaining the behavior, the actions of states in the system, it is still a system theory. How is that? First of all, state preferences may also reflect transnational societal preferences. For example, there are transnational cultural values, love for different types of music, or love for sports, acceptance of sports as an important part of our culture. This is something which is transnational. It's not just for the United States. It's not just for Russia. It's not just for China. All states around the world share, or many states around the world share, those values or those cultural norms. So that means that the US support, or the US strong value for fair behavior in a sporting event, for that example, as a value, is not something which is just unique to the United States. It's something which is globally accepted. So sometimes the preferences of the state also reflect the international types of transnational values. Second, the behavior by each state, according to liberalism, depends on the configuration of preferences of other states. It is called interdependence, and I'll get to that term in a few minutes. In that sense, the behavior, the action that each state engage based on the liberal theory is a better reflection of engaging in a rational choice, because the behavior is based on the preferences of my preferences and other states' preferences rather than our capabilities, right? Because realists tell us that military capabilities and financial capabilities will determine how I will behave as one state in the international system. Liberalism tells us, and that's accepted as a system theory, right? Liberalism tells us that my behavior as one state in the international system will also depend on the different preferences that other states will have. So I'm actually engaging in a rational decision process, which is a better fit to providing a general explanation, a general theory that will explain states' behavior in the international system, right? So this is the two counters that the theory provides in terms of why, even though it is heavily reliant on states' preferences as something which is internal to the states themselves, as explaining its behavior in the international system, it still fits within a structural theory. Okay, let's move ahead and talk about the main assumptions of the liberal theory. You even had this as a question in the quiz for today. Let's start about that. Sorry. The first assumption is similar to everything that I've talked about so far. Individual preferences will drive the behavior of the state. So the state's action in the international system will depend on the individual preferences of members of society. That means that the liberal theory is based on what's called a bottom-up view, in which the demands of individuals and different societal groups are the priors to behavior. This is what they will determine the action that the states will take in the international system. These are rational demands that each one of members of society has. They are aggregated, right? Because we're taking each individual's preference and we're aggregating together. How are they aggregated? Through political exchange and collective action. So different political mechanisms that we exist. For example, having political parties to represent our preferences. For each one of us, we have our own preferences. What do we prefer? And we have representatives that are supposed to reflect that. So political parties are one type of political institution that aggregate preferences. And then those political parties are reflected into selecting our elected official, the president, or in other types of regimes, we have a government which is led by the prime minister or things like that, right? So this is how individual preferences are aggregated through a political process and are turning into the actual state actions. Now, it is important to think about, to understand that the purpose of individual preferences, each one of us as members of society, the purpose of our preferences is to promote our own material and ideal welfare. Our demands, our preferences again, but we can also call them our demands, are based on the fact that the resources in society are scarce, and that means that each one of us has to behave in a self-interest and risk-averse manner. And the idea behind those arguments is, again, this is part of the efforts that Moravchik has made to describe that theory as a scientific theory and not talk about the fact that the convergence of interest of members of society is not some harmony or utopia. All of us here, members of society in the United States, are sitting together around the fireplace and our preferences are the same. No, this is preferences of the states which are aggregating each one of us. We have our own preferences, but we are engaged in a self-interest and risk-averse behavior because the resources are scarce. Not all of us can have the same paycheck. Not all of us can have the same resources to ourselves. So that's the idea behind that. Okay, the second assumption suggests that the state is not an individual actor, such as we have in the realist perspective. Instead, it is a representing institution of different coalitions of societal actors. For example, multiple parties which comprise the state's political system. These institutions, and parties is just one example, drive the aggregation of social preferences into a state policy. Eventually, the final outcome of all those aggregations of different preferences of members of society is different policies that we have. Now, that essentially what that means is that the government policy, whichever policy in whichever area, we're focusing, of course, on foreign policy, but it's true also in domestic policy. But every government policy is constrained by the underlying identities, interests, and power of individuals and groups. Some of those individuals and groups are inside, some of those are outside of the state's apparatus. Each one of those groups or individuals constantly pressure the central decision makers to pursue policies which are consistent with their preferences. If I prefer to have more liberal view or more free trade, this is my preference when it comes to international trade, then I will pressure my congressman and then my senator and hopefully eventually the president to adopt this kind of policy. On the other hand, there can be many other groups in society which do not prefer to have free trade and want a more type of a protective type of trade policy. So they will pressure their own representative to do that, and eventually we'll have a policy based on that. One more point that Moravchik is highlighting in order to avoid from a utopian view that all of us are represented is that the government represents some groups more than others. There's no actually an equal representation to all groups of society. The interest of those groups which have better representation by the government are more likely to be the driving behavior of the state actions. Even when we have a formal, fair, and open regime such as democratic institution, it's still not an equal representation to everyone. And we know that from our everyday now, right? So members of different groups in society are driving their preferences are being aggregated through political parties, through interest groups, through different groups that pressure the political process, and those are driving the policies that states are making. And all that so far, everything I've talked about so far for the first assumption, and actually the second assumption, is relevant also for domestic policy, right? If we're talking about any types of social policy, economic policy within the United States, within Britain, within Russia, within France, or any other types of policy. And now comes into play the last assumption, which will link us back into the international system. And according to this assumption, this is what puts the state back into the system. Every state will try to follow the preferences of its social actor, right? But at the same time, every state within the international system must also work to realize those policies, those preferences within the constraints of other states' preferences. So if the United States, let's say that my preference of free trade is being promoted, and the president of the United States currently or in the past, it doesn't matter, will promote for a policy which includes a free trade between countries. But this president, this administration also has to face the fact that he is in interaction with other countries in the world in the international system, and some of them may not accept this kind of open free trade. They will prefer maybe a more restricted types of trade. So the policies that are going to be implemented eventually within the international system, the actions that my country is going to take within the international system also depend on the preferences of other states, which depends on the preferences of the members of society in those states, right? So this is how the aggregation of preferences of members of society, which is more of an internal types of element, is being translated into the international system, and how it actually serves as a constraint on the fact that not everything that I want as a citizen, if I'm a citizen of the United States, not everything that I want will actually happen in the international system. I may have to accept some compromise, right? That's the idea behind the basics of the liberal theory. But still, there's a lot of incentives overall in order to engage in cooperation and trying to find the common ground. And I'll give you some examples in a few minutes. But if I'm very open to free trade and other countries are less, we have incentives to talk amongst ourselves and to find the common ground in order to get some relatively higher level of free trade that I will accept, but will also be acceptable on other states. And then overall, the welfare of all of us here in the United States, along with members of China and, I don't know, Italy and Czechoslovakia, there's no Czechoslovakia anymore, and Romania, all of us will be better off after our negotiation and coming into agreement on acting and engaging in actions that are cooperative. And that's the idea, the basic idea behind the liberal theory. Okay, now I want to talk about some of the main elements of the theory a little bit beyond those assumptions. First, one of the most important elements of the liberal theory are social norms. We have here an example to the way that social norms are sometimes materialized in reality. Now, I don't want to put this as this is how the United States looks in the world, because this is a picture I'm guessing from the subway in New York City. And this is how people go board the train in East Asia. It's possible that it's the same in both countries. This is just a picture that I found, but it was just intended to show you the example about social norms. I'll give you example from my own personal life. When I came here from Israel, from the Middle East, I was very surprised to see the way that students here in the university behave when they have to stand in line and wait for the bus, when we are forming a queue, even though there's no bus. And that's the basic example of what a social norm is. There is a line here when we're waiting for the bus. Even though the bus is not even here, we are already forming a queue or a line and we're standing in line and not just waiting for the bus to come here, and then all of us are just crushing in on the door. That's the idea behind having social norms. So let's talk about that more specifically. So norms are a central principle of the liberal perspective. There's a broadly defined patterns of conduct. They are accepted patterns of behavior that serve as an informal means to encourage broadly accepted behavior without the official force of a law behind them. When I gave you this example about here, students in A&M forming this queue to wait for the bus, there's no rule that requires us to do it, right? This is just an accepted pattern of behavior that we engaged in, and it will encourage everyone to behave the same way in a cooperative manner. For our context in international relations, an example for an accepted norm is respecting the territorial boundaries of neighbors. We are expecting the territorial boundaries of Canada here, or Mexico for that matter, or in other places in the world. The acceptance on this principle is based on understanding that this is an accepted mode of conduct, right? So both members in the United States and members in Canada understand that we have to accept the territorial boundaries and not just cross the boundary the border every day, because this is the accepted mode of conduct. No, just a second. Sorry about that. When we view the norm in that matter, it suggests that despite there is difficulty to enforce territorial integrity with a law, right? It's very hard to accept an international law that's going to say the United States cannot cross the border in the north border into Canada and the opposite for Canada. But when we accept it as a norm, we can suggest that even though it's difficult to enforce that with an actual law, we can enforce that just based on the fact that we have shared value. We accept the sovereignty of Canada until where the border is marked up north, and they accept the United States sovereignty where the border is marked south for them. And this is one of the important differences with realist views, where those kinds of things are just not part of the discussion. Norms and values, cultural and political and national norms and values also promote cooperation by demonstrating that those that disrespect those norms are behaving in an unacceptable way, and they are subject to punishment, right? So there can be some sanctions for those who violate those norms. Those who decide to cross the border when they're not allowed to, there is sanctions for those individuals. And this is where the assumption of having a hierarchy as part of the international system is very important, because it is necessary to have one country in the world which is powerful enough in order to enforce those kinds of punishments. Norms change with time and experience, leading to changes in the patterns of international interactions. Since norms are less strict than accepted and codified laws, it's easier to change norms, and they are also more easily evolve or modify over time. At the same time, we can also argue that because norms, in many ways, the change in norms is predicated on any kind of require accepted social process, that actually may take longer to have a change in a norm, because the society has to accept those kinds of changes. But nevertheless, we still can see changes in norms. And let's look at some of the examples in order to see how some of the norms that were very accepted in the past, how they are viewed today, especially in the context of our discussion about the different actions of states in the international system. So one example is political assassination. Today, it is a pretty accepted norm throughout the globe that prohibit the targeting of political leader in terms of capture or assassination, right? There's some of it even led to laws with the United States when it comes to specific contexts, such as the war on terrorism. But in the Middle Ages, these were legitimate tactics of war, assassinating the leaders of another country, of another group. That was accepted. That was an accepted norm in the Middle Ages. It is not accepted today. Today, there's very clear norms that reject the negative conduct towards POWs, prisoners of war, for example, ransoming POWs for money. But it was acceptable and even considered humane treatment of prisoners during the 100 years war, which took place back in the 14th and 15th centuries. So those norms that were accepted there at the time have changed over the last 600 years, and they're not accepted today. One more example, when it comes to sort of prisoners of war or suspects of illegal any types of behavior, we can think about torture and the changes in the way that society views torture. So in the 12th century, the Catholic Church viewed torture as a mean to save souls. It was perceived as a legitimate and efficient and even progressive way to fight crime at the time. And today, of course, is not an acceptable norm, especially in democratic countries. Just think about the outcry that took place here in the United States over the events that happened in the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq way back in the beginning of the 2000s. Then the US government interrogation tactics when it comes to the war with Al-Qaeda, things that happened in Guantanamo. What I want to show you here are results of a survey that took place in about 2014, 2015, that asks public members about their opinions about different types of interrogation and detention techniques. And you can see that here we have the more extreme types of interrogation, making the suspects go naked, holding the suspect's head underwater, and the level of opposition to that are very, very, very high. So society today is very rejecting of those kinds of actions. And this is just an example from a paper that focused on behavior towards terrorism suspects. But again, this gives us some idea about how those things change. We can only think about how the public viewed those things way back in the 12th century when you had questions about not allowing the suspect to sleep and how much support was on those kinds of actions way back at the time. Now, when informal norms cannot lead to the desired change in behavior and resolve any kind of international disputes, any kind of international actions which are unacceptable, then usually those norms are supported by formal and codified law of conduct and enforcement mechanisms such as courts. We have that in the domestic area. We have norms about stealing, and if somebody breaks those norms and engages in stealing, we can send that person to, this person will be prosecuted in court and may end up in prison. Similarly, we have the same kind of dynamic taking place in the international system. There are some norms. If they are not successful in altering individuals' countries' behavior, there are international courts where you can actually follow that and follow through and engage in that. All right, another central element in the theory of liberalism is international regimes. International regimes are a set of international laws, rules, and organizations that are designed to promote coordination and cooperation between actors who have shared interest. We have here all kinds of examples for international organizations which are part of these international cooperation regimes. Many of those organizations here are related to the United Nations, but we also have here the WHO, the World Health Organizations, which of course has become very central over the last little over a year, unfortunately, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, and others. Now, those international regimes are a set, as I said, of, this is the definition which I just gave you, a set of international laws, rules, and organizations designed to promote coordination. These regimes, which are based on clear shared norms, promote cooperation and support the natural inclinations that states have to maximize their wealth. Every state wants to increase its own wealth. So we have a natural incentive or inclination to work with others in order to increase our own wealth. Those kinds of regimes complement international laws. So as I said, they consist of different rules and regulations that, while they lack the force of an actual laws, they can be very effective in shaping behavior in the international system. International systems promote the importance of ideas by emphasizing how those ideas are spread and by highlighting the reputational cost of violation. So it's not just clear cost if you violate any kind of norm, there's also reputational cost. Now we know that the country of, let's just say New Zealand, because they never do that, but let's just say New Zealand has been violating the law of sovereignty of some kind of other country for a long time. So everybody knows that, and that's a clear reputational cost that New Zealand will pay if this is something that all of us are aware of. International laws, which, as we said, are complementary to those kinds of regime, is a critical component of liberal theories. It would serve as an important, strong constraint on the behavior of actors in the international system. Even when in some cases international laws set up accepted behavior, which is contrary to the short-term self-interest of actors. So sometimes actors in the international system, states, will try to engage in actions which have clear self-interest to those states and have short-term positive repercussions for those states, but those actions in many cases, or in some cases actually, violate international laws, and international laws are designed just like that in order to overcome all those short-term incentives that some states have and create a more long-term perspective of behavior, which also encourages more cooperation. Let's take an example for what is an international regime, but first look at this more in the domestic sense. So the Better Business Bureau is an example for a regime. It is a modern day regime that lacks the power of law. It does not have a law behind it, but it's a very powerful tool in exposing businesses that violate any kind of agreed patterns of behavior. And so even when compliance with those agreed patterns of behavior is not compulsory, so there's no law that says that some types of action in the business world are required. Sometimes it's just an accepted patterns of behavior. And this BBB organization is exposing those that violate. And the mere threat of being exposed, in many cases, is sufficient to induce compliance by various businesses. So businesses will not violate some of those basic norms of behavior in the business world because they are concerned that they will be exposed by a regime such as the BBB, and then they will essentially lose their clients and won't be able to increase their own wealth, right? This is where the dynamic is relatively similar to the way that states behave in the international system. A more relevant example to our discussion about international relations is trade agreements, trade regimes. Trade regimes include different agreements and relevant institutions that are designed to regulate and enforce certain trade policies, and NAFTA is one example. This is a trade agreement between the United States, Mexico, and Canada. They are means to foster cooperation among the different participants, even though in many cases, and they intended to provide, of course, successful cooperation between them, even though in many cases there's clear asymmetries in the relative gains or the relative powers of those actors. So there's clear asymmetries in the power and the gains sometimes between Canada, the United States, and Mexico in their trade relations. But an organization, a regime such as NAFTA, is intended to sustain the cooperation between those three actors, even though it's not always exactly share part, right? That's the idea behind this kind of a regime. Okay. All right, let's keep going. One of the most prominent, just a second, there it is. One of the most prominent perspective within liberalism is what's called the theory of interdependence. It was introduced by two professors, Keown and Nye, in the late 1970s. The focus of this theory, which relies heavily on many of the principles of liberalism, is to discuss international relations in the context of political economy rather than security. Therefore, the main, if you want to call that, the main variables that this theory focuses on are very different from realism because it relies and focuses on the distribution of shared interests, which are mostly related to trade and cultural norms, rather than looking at the distribution of power, right? In realism, the distribution of power was the most important thing that drives the actions of states. In this case, we're looking at the distributions of shared interests between states, which are heavily dependent upon trade and cultural norms when it comes to trade between states and shared cultural norms. Now, the link between states' preferences, which was, again, the foundations of liberal theory, and the behavior of other states is the concept which I talked about earlier, and I promise you that I'll go back to. It's policy interdependence. Policy interdependence are the different benefits as well as the cost, the benefits that states are getting, but mostly the set of costs that are imposed on states when all of them are trying to implement their own preferences. Each state tries to implement its own preferences. If I don't care about others, then I may impose a cost on them, even though I may get some benefits from it. And the same thing, others can try to implement their own preferences, and I may pay a cost because of that. So those are the different costs as well as benefits that states are getting from implementing their preferred policies. This is also called transnational externalities. And in a sense, it serves, again, this thing that I talked about when I talked about the assumptions, a constraints on global behavior. The policy that I'm implementing in the international system is also dependent on the preferences and the expectations of other countries. And my policy has an effect on the way that Germany behaves. And the way that Germany behaves, the policies that Germany enacts, also has an effect on me. This is this interdependence between us. Now, I want to focus in the context of talking about this interdependence concept, how those patterns of interdependence between different actors in the international system, how they fit to different categories in terms of how that affects the relations or the outcomes in the international system and the interactions between states. So what patterns of interdependence lead to conflicts in this case? When preferences are compatible, what's called optimal externality. So my preferences are very similar to the preferences of Canada, let's stay with this example. So the likelihood of conflict is very, very low because coordination is easier. Everything, the main things in the policy that I want as the United States is very similar to what Canada wants. We can coordinate on policies, find the common ground, and then just cooperate on that. So there's a low likelihood of conflict. If the preferences fit what's called a zero-sum pattern, then if I'm implementing my preferences, there is some cost that is necessarily imposed on others. As a result, the governments of the United States and Canada, if we stay with this example, we face a bargaining game when there is very few mutual interests. If everything that I get means that Canada loses everything, there's very few mutual gains from us cooperating with one another, and there is a strong likelihood for tensions and conflict between us. This is when our preferences fit a zero sum. What I get means you get nothing. And when the motives for both actors are mixed, then states realize that concessions by engaging in coordination can improve both actors' welfare. So if we have mixed motives and both us and Canada understand that by cooperating, by coordinating our actions with one another, we can, maybe I have to give up on some, maybe Canada has to provide some concessions, but overall the welfare of both of us will be better than if each one of us will take unilateral actions. All of that provide us incentives for this cooperation and coordination and eventually coming up with a better solution. That's the idea behind interdependence and different patterns of preferences between actors. All right. What I want to talk about now is another example of the pattern of interactions within the liberal theory and talk about, there it is, interactions when it comes to the international system and then between states when it comes to commerce and trade. So the focus here is on the different market incentives that are created by the different opportunities for trans-border economic transactions. So that create the opportunities to create transactions across borders create also different market incentives. This view of free trade stresses the interactions between aggregated incentives. So each country has its own aggregated incentives and the different obstacles that those actors face. The market structure is the crucial element that creates the incentives for accepting a policy of an open market or closer market in terms of international trade and transaction, right? So this is how the system fits with the aggregated preferences of the different members of society for each one of those countries. The idea is that changes in the structure of the domestic and the global economy will alter the cost and benefits of transnational economic exchange and create pressure on domestic governments to engage in policies that either facilitate economic exchanges or block economic exchanges through their appropriate policies, right? So this is the difference, changes in the global economy as well as in the domestic economy that lead to those changes in policy. And the structure of the international the systems and the incentives, the overall incentives for growth, push for a much more liberal economic policy. Overall, the way that the international system is structured currently means that we should have incentives to facilitate more free trade with fewer incentives. Overall, that's what the system leads us when it comes to engaging more cooperation between states, the preferences of members of society to increase their own wealth. So overall, we should have more incentives for a free trade globally with fewer restrictions. Now, there's a couple of things we need to think about that, and this is just an example for an illustration for the questions of free trade versus protectionism, which I will not go in details now. I'll talk about it more when I'll talk about the international political economy that we have in a few weeks. But the idea behind that is whether there is a greater support within society for overall free trade and removing restrictions on trade, or having more restrictions and more protectionism for products that are created here in the United States, as an example. Here we have an example for each one of those actors is focusing on its own technology and not sharing technology among countries. This is what this picture illustrates. Now, overall, the argument is, and this is what most economic theories are telling us, free trades promote more higher aggregated welfare based on specific elements, which are called specialization and functional differentiation, which I will not go into details now. But overall, the idea in economic theory is that free trade improves the welfare of everyone. However, there are counter arguments to that, which are mostly revolve around what's called domestic distributional conflict, which means that when the cost and the benefits of a national policy, such as free trade, are not internalized equally. So not everyone in society in the United States get the same benefits from free trade. Some get more, some get less. And this is more of a specific conditions which are part of the trade policy. But that is the counter argument to why should we not look at free trade always as the best solution. Now, the fact that there's this inequality, some get more from free trade, some get less, create incentive for some sectors, and those sectors are led by their representative of the union, to encourage pressure on policymakers to accept a policy that will provide general benefits or personal benefits for those sectors at the expense of the aggregate welfare. So those who are suffering more from free trade will pressure members of the political system, their representative, to actually engage in different protectionist policies that provide benefits to those sectors. And an example sector for that is agriculture, but the benefits given to those sectors will be at the expense of the increase in welfare for everyone in society. That's part of the idea behind that. How do the liberal theories are supposed to push us for more cooperation and increase benefits for everyone, but the fact that in practice, not all those benefits are realized equally among members of society may lead to domestic preferences that actually push for more protectionism. And this is more relevant for specific sectors which are non-competitive and it's harder for them to diversify. And we'll talk about those specific aspects when I talked about political economy. But those are different types of sectors in the economy that suffer more or get less benefits from free trade, and they have a lot more incentives to oppose to that. Okay, before talking about the very last topic of today, I will stop for today's attendance word. So today's attendance word is the word goodbye, as in goodbye. So attendance word for today is the word goodbye. The last thing I want to talk about really over the last couple of minutes that we have left is how do we fit the liberal theory into providing or having a general theory in international relations that can explain the actions of states in the system. We should look at that according to, this is coming back to the discussion that Moravchik has in its own paper, as a two-stage process of behavior. Liberal theory promotes the study of state behavior based on this two-stage process, which called two-stage process of constrained social choice. So the social choice, the social preferences constrain the behavior of the states eventually. States begin in this phase here with defining their preferences. This is the state's preferences, and those are defined, right, on aggregating different ideational, commercial, and Republican variates or different social preferences using domestic institutions and political processes, right? So whether it is interest groups, whether it is political parties, whether it is different political representatives, those are the different domestic institutions which aggregate the different preferences of members of society, every one of us, And that's going to lead to what is called, according to the liberal theory, the state's preferences. The United States prefer more free trade than protectionism. China prefers more open borders than closed of borders in some areas, just as an example. Now, those state preferences are interacting, or just working together in a strategic interaction sense based on along with those realist and institutionalist factors, which are the distribution of capabilities, the distribution of power. So those are the realist elements of the system, and they are in strategic interactions with the state preferences, and that lead to the systematic outcomes, right? This is where we actually argue, according to liberalism, that in order to explain the system outcomes, the way that states behave or the actions that states are taking in the international system, which should account for the different realist factors, such as the distribution of capabilities and the interaction of those capabilities along with the state's preferences. This is where the realist theory comes into play. And this view places us much closer to exploring the effects of internal factors, things that happens between states and how they shape the systematic outcomes, the international behavior. And in essence, that's going to lead me to the final slide. This is going to be our topic for a Wednesday. I will start talking about or look into this black box, reminding you the system theories usually focus on looking at states as billiard balls, or they are black boxes. We don't care what happened between states. And the discussion that we had today about liberalism was supposed to be the first step, leading us to talk more about how different processes and dynamics that takes place within states have an effect on the way that those states behave in the international system. So we're shifting from the system level of analysis to the nation state level of analysis. That's going to be the main topic we want to talk about on Wednesday. All right, reminding you again, tomorrow you'll get the link to the first survey due by Friday. And of course, office hours this week are as usual. If you have anything, you are more than welcome to come join me on office hours. If you have cool pictures that you want to put in the background, not just Super Bowl, which is already over, then send them to me, and that's it. With that, I'm done for today. Have a nice day, everyone, and stay safe.